The Iron Creek depot had not seen a locomotive in 20 years, and the silence that draped over its rotting eaves was heavy enough to crush a man's spirit. The tracks themselves were no longer veins of commerce, but scars of rust bleeding into the dry, unforgiving earth of the basin. Most of the townsfolk of Oakhaven looked at the structure and saw only a tomb for an era that had died with the silver mines, a colossal wooden husk where the wind whistled through shattered glass like a mourner's wail. But Thaddeus saw something else. He stood on the platform, his boots crunching on a layer of blown sand and coal dust, and looked up at the vaulted ceiling of the main terminal. The roof was still sound, built from old-growth timber that had hardened rather than rotted, and the high clear-story windows, though grime-streaked, caught the southern sun and trapped it against the floorboards. He held the deed in his calloused hand, the paper trembling slightly in the biting wind that scoured the plains. The ink was still fresh, marking him as the owner of the folly. In the saloon the night before, the laughter had been raucous when he slapped his last remaining gold on the counter. They called him the King of Rust, the mayor joking that Thaddeus could now farm tumbleweeds and harvest dust. Thaddeus didn't laugh. He knew the soil on his ranch had turned to chalk, the aquifer drying up until his cattle were nothing but ribs and thirst. This station, with its deep cisterns and glass walls, was not a ruin to him. It was a terrarium. It was a last chance. Sarah arrived an hour later, driving the buckboard wagon loaded with the last of their tools in the meager sack of provisions. She pulled the reins, the old mare blowing hard in the cold air, and looked up at the towering, peeling facade of the station. She didn't smile, but she didn't weep either. She possessed a quiet, steely resolve that had kept them anchored when the drought took the herd. Climbing down, she wrapped her shawl tighter against the chill and joined Thaddeus on the platform. He didn't say a word, simply gesturing to the expanse of the waiting room. The floor was a mosaic of birdlime and debris, but the space was vast, protected from the killing frost that came earlier and earlier each year. Sarah walked to the center of the room, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. She ran a gloved hand over a bench that had once held travelers waiting for the eastbound express. Now it would hold trays of soil. She looked at Thaddeus, her eyes tired but clear. She saw the desperation in the set of his jaw, the way he looked at the light pooling on the floor. It was a madness, perhaps, to plant vegetables in a train station, to turn a place of transit into a place of roots. But the land outside was dead, and here there was shelter. She nodded, a small, nearly imperceptible motion, and went back to the wagon to fetch the shovels. The romance of their life was no longer found in soft words or leisurely rides. It was found here, in the shared shoulder-to-shoulder resistance against the end of things. The cleaning was a war of attrition waged against 2 decades of neglect. For 3 days they did nothing but shovel. Thaddeus took the heavy spade, scraping layers of hardened mud and refuse from the heart pine floors, while Sarah swept with a broom made of stiff twigs, creating clouds of dust that danced in the shafts of sunlight. The air inside the station was thick and acrid, tasting of old soot and ammonia. They tied bandanas over their faces, looking like bandits robbing a bank that had no money. The physical toll was immense. Every muscle in Thaddeus's back screamed as he hauled wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow of debris out to the tracks, dumping it far down the line. But with every layer stripped away, the station began to breathe again. Beneath the filth, the wood was rich and red. Beneath the grime on the windows, which Sarah scrubbed with vinegar and rags until her knuckles were raw, the light became clear and golden. They worked in a rhythm born of years of marriage, passing tools without speaking, anticipating the other's need for water or a moment of rest. When the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the station in long, blue shadows, they sat on the clean floor, eating cold biscuits and beans. The wind howled outside, battering the walls, but inside, the air was still. Sarah leaned her head against Thaddeus's shoulder, the smell of sweat and dust on them both. It wasn't comfortable, but it was warm. They were carving a home out of a carcass. Once the floor was cleared, the real labor began. The importation of the earth. The soil surrounding the station was useless, packed hard and stripped of nutrients. They had to travel 5 miles to the riverbed, where the silt was dark and loamy and haul it back in the wagon. It was a grueling, repetitive circuit. Thaddeus shoveled the heavy, wet earth into the wagon bed until the axles groaned, drove the slow miles back, and then transferred the soil into the station. They didn't have pots, so they built raised beds directly on the floorboards using the old railway ties they pried from the siding. The smell of the station changed. The sharp metallic tang of the rails was replaced by the rich, damp scent of fertile ground. They laid the beds in long rows where the benches had been, mimicking the parallel lines of the track. It was a railway of vegetation, a transit line for sustenance. Thaddeus constructed a pulley system to hoist buckets of water from the station's deep, stone-lined cistern, water that the town had forgotten existed. As he poured the first bucket over the dark soil, watching it soak in rather than run off, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Control. He wasn't at the mercy of the open sky here. He was the conductor of this small world. Sarah knelt beside the beds, her hands deep in the dirt, breaking up clods and mixing in the compost they had saved. Her hands, once soft, were now as rough as his, but he thought they had never looked more beautiful. The skepticism of Oakhaven did not stay in the town. It rode out to meet them in the form of Mayor Thorne. He arrived in a polished buggy, wearing a coat that cost more than Thaddeus's farm had ever yielded in a single year. He stepped onto the platform, his nose wrinkling at the smell of manure and wet earth. He didn't enter the station. He stood in the doorway, framed by the bright winter light, looking like a vulture inspecting a dying animal. He laughed, a dry rattling sound. He asked if Thaddeus planned to sell tickets to the turnips, or if the cabbages were planning to catch the noon train to Denver. He called it a folly, a desperate act of a man who didn't know when to quit. He warned them that the glass would freeze, that the station was a drafty sieve, and that they would freeze to death alongside their foolish plants. Thaddeus didn't stop working. He continued to smooth the soil in the third bed, his back to the mayor. It was Sarah who spoke. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her apron, and met Thorne's gaze with a terrifying calmness. She told him that hunger was a patient teacher, and that while the town ate their dried beef and flour, she and Thaddeus would be eating fresh greens. Thorne sneered, tipping his hat with mock politeness, and left. But the encounter left a residue. That night, doubt crept in. Thaddeus sat by the cast-iron stove they had installed, staring at the fire. Sarah placed a hand on the back of his neck, her fingers digging into the tension there. She whispered that the seeds didn't know the mayor. They only knew the soil. The planting was a sacred act. They had traded their wedding bands, temporarily pawned to the mercantile, for high-quality seeds, winter kale, hardy spinach, carrots, and beets, root vegetables and tough greens that could survive the cold. They moved down the rows of the Vege railway, Thaddeus making the furrows with a sharpened stick, Sarah dropping the seeds with precision. One by one, the tiny specks of potential vanished into the dark earth. It was a gamble of the highest order. If this failed, they would have nothing. No farm, no money, no food. The silence of the station was different now. It was expectant. After the planting, the waiting began. Days turned into a week. The temperature outside dropped plummeting well below freezing. The wind battered the glass, rattling the panes in their frames. Thaddeus spent his nights caulking the gaps with a mixture of clay and moss, hunting for drafts like a man hunting wolves. He slept in shifts, waking every 2 hours to stoke the stove, keeping the ambient temperature just above the danger zone. Sarah monitored the moisture, checking the soil constantly. Then, on the 9th morning, under the pale, watery light of a Tuesday dawn, it happened. Thaddeus was dozing in the chair when Sarah shook him awake. She didn't speak. She just pointed. In the first bed, nearest the stove, a row of tiny, vibrant green hooks had broken the surface. They were impossibly small, fragile things against the backdrop of the massive industrial ruin. Thaddeus fell to his knees to look closer, his breath hitching. It was life. But as they watched the miracle, the wind outside changed pitch, rising to a scream. A blizzard was coming, a white death rolling down from the mountains, and the glass walls of the station suddenly felt very thin. The blizzard hit the Iron Creek depot not with a howl, but with a concussive slam, as if a massive, invisible fist had struck the northern face of the building. The glass walls, previously their source of light and hope, instantly became their greatest liability. The temperature inside plummeted within minutes, the cold seeping through the thousands of iron seams that held the panes in place. Thaddeus moved with the frantic energy of a man trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. He dragged the heavy canvas tarps they had salvaged from the wagon and began nailing them over the lower sections of the windows, his hammer blows lost in the screaming wind outside. Sarah was already moving down the rows of the Vege railway, sacrificing their own bedding, heaving wool quilts and patchwork comforters to drape over the fragile seedlings. The cast-iron stove, which had been a comforting heart of the room, was now a ravenous beast that demanded constant feeding, just to keep the frost from creeping across the floorboards. Thaddeus fed it the last of the dry wood, then the broken chairs, and finally, with a grim look, he began chopping up the ornamental molding from the ticket booth. The air was a chaotic mix of freezing drafts and pockets of intense, dry heat near the fire. They worked in a tunnel of lantern light, the rest of the station swallowed by the white void pressing against the glass. Thaddeus's fingers were stiff and clumsy, numb despite the exertion. He looked at Sarah, her face smudged with soot, her breath pluming in the air as she tucked the blankets around the kale as if they were children. "The coal won't last the night," Thaddeus said, his voice rough. "If the fire dies, the frost takes the roots in an hour." Sarah didn't look up, her hand smoothing a quilt. "Then we burn the floor of the waiting room," she said, her voice flat and absolute. "We burn the benches, we burn the walls if we have to, but the dirt stays warm." It was a terrifying calculus, dismantling the shelter to save the life inside it, but Thaddeus nodded, grabbing the axe. They spent the darkest hours of the night tearing up the very planks they stood on at the far end of the station, feeding the history of the building into the fire to buy a future for the green shoots hidden beneath the wool. The storm broke 2 days later, leaving the station half buried in a drift that reached the clear-story windows, but the silence that followed brought a new visitor. He didn't come by horse or wagon, for the roads were impassable. He came on snowshoes, a dark, shambling shape against the blinding white. It was Tobias, a man the town considered a hermit, a retired brakeman who had worked this line when the silver flowed like water. He entered the station through the sliding cargo door, shaking the snow from his bearskin coat like a wet dog. Thaddeus stood up from the garden beds, gripping his axe, wary of any intrusion, but Tobias didn't look at him. He looked at the rows of blanket-covered mounds, then at the hacked-up floorboards, and finally at the stove glowing red-hot. He grunted, a sound like gravel grinding together. "You're burning heart pine in a potbelly," Tobias said, pointing a gnarled finger at the stove. "Inefficient. You're heating the air, and the air goes up to the rafters. The plants don't live in the air, son. They live in the dirt." Thaddeus lowered the axe slightly. "It's the only stove we have," he replied defensively. Tobias walked past him, limping slightly, and knelt by the wall near the old ticket office. He pulled a pry bar from his belt and jammed it into a seam in the floor that Thaddeus hadn't noticed. With a groan of rusted metal, a grate popped open, revealing a dark, brick-lined channel running beneath the floor. "Hippocaust system," Tobias muttered, peering into the gloom. "Built to keep the pipes from freezing in '85. It runs under the whole platform. You feed the fire into the intake in the basement, not this toy stove, and the smoke runs under the floor before it goes up the chimney. Heats the wood, heats the soil from the bottom up." He looked up at Sarah, his eyes sharp under bushy gray brows. "You got a jungle trying to grow in a freezer. Let me show you how to run the engine." For the next week, Tobias didn't leave. He became the engineer of their survival, teaching Thaddeus how to clear the soot-choked flues and redirect the airflow. When they lit the basement furnace, the effect was miraculous. The floorboards became warm to the touch, radiating a gentle, consistent heat that rose through the raised beds. The desperate searing heat of the potbelly stove was replaced by a pervasive ambient warmth, like a living body. The station was no longer fighting the cold, it was ignoring it. Time in the station began to detach from the calendar of the outside world. Outside, Oakhaven was locked in the gray, starving grip of deep winter. The cattle on the neighboring ranches were gaunt, huddling against the wind, and the town's pantry shelves were stripped bare of anything fresh. But inside the Iron Creek depot, it was a humid, verdant spring. The Vege railway had exploded into a riot of growth. The kale, fed by the rich river silt and the constant subfloor warmth, stood 2 feet high, their leaves dark, crinkled, and waxy. The spinach was a carpet of vibrant emerald, and the tops of the carrots were feathery plumes that brushed Thaddeus's knees as he walked the rows. The smell of the station was intoxicating, a heavy, earthy perfume of crushed greens, wet soil, and the faint, sweet scent of beet leaves. It was a sensory shock to walk from the biting, sterile cold of the platform into the humid embrace of the terminal. The work had shifted from the frantic construction to the steady, rhythmic maintenance of farming. Thaddeus and Sarah moved through the foliage like gardeners in Eden, pruning, thinning, and watering. They no longer wore their heavy coats inside. Thaddeus worked in his shirt sleeves, his forearms stained with chlorophyll and dirt. One afternoon, Sarah pulled a carrot from the earth. It came free with a wet sucking sound, bright orange and perfectly formed, shocking in its color against the brown dirt. She wiped it on her apron and snapped it in half, the crisp sound echoing in the quiet hall. She handed half to Thaddeus. They stood there, surrounded by the ghost of the railway, eating the sweet, crunchy root. It tasted of sugar and minerals, a taste so sharp and alive it made Thaddeus's jaw ache. "It's ready," Sarah said softly, looking at the rows and rows of abundance that stretched to the far wall. "All of it. It's ready." They had more food than they could eat in a year. The station had become a granary of greens, a fortress of nutrition in a landscape of famine. The first wagon arrived from town a week later, driven by the skepticism that hunger had finally eroded. It wasn't the mayor, but the baker's son, a young man with hollow cheeks and eyes that widened until they were saucer-sized as he stepped through the doors. He had come to trade a bag of weevil-ridden flour for anything green, perhaps expecting a handful of withered leaves. When he saw the lush rows of the Vege railway, he dropped the flour sack, white dust puffing around his boots. He left with a crate of spinach and chard, weeping openly. The news traveled faster than the telegraph ever had. By the next day, a line of wagons and buggies stood on the rusted tracks outside. The people of Oakhaven, who had mocked the king of rust, now stood hat in hand on the platform. Thaddeus and Sarah set up a table using an old luggage cart. They didn't ask for gold. Gold couldn't be eaten. They traded for labor, for lumber, for the promise of spring calves. Mayor Thorne was the last to arrive. He walked slowly, his fine coat hanging loosely on his frame, his face gray with the vitamin deficiencies that were plaguing the wealthy and poor alike. He stood before the table where piles of deep purple beets and bunches of kale lay like jewels. He looked at Thaddeus, then at the vaulted ceiling, then at the thriving beds. There was no sneer left in him, only the crushing weight of his own error. I have silver," Thorne said quietly, his voice lacking its usual boom. Thaddeus didn't look up from the scale. He placed a heavy bunch of carrots on the tray. "We don't need silver, Mayor, but the south wall needs reglazing, and the roof leaks over the ticket booth. You have men. Send them tomorrow." Thorne swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "Tomorrow," he agreed. He took the carrots with trembling hands, clutching them as if they were the keys to the city. The dynamic had inverted completely. The railway station, once the symbol of the town's failure, was now its life support, and the pariahs were its saviors. As the weeks turned towards the equinox, the harsh white of the plains began to break into patches of muddy brown. The spring thaw was coming, but the panic of survival had passed. The station was now a hub of activity, not of travel, but of community. Men from the town were on ladders repairing the high windows, their laughter mixing with the sound of hammers. Women sat on the remaining benches, stripping chard and sharing recipes for the strange, hardy greens that had saved their children from sickness. Thaddeus and Sarah sat on the edge of the cargo platform, their legs dangling over the side, watching the sun set over the reviving land. The work was far from over. The success of the winter meant the station would need to be expanded, the cisterns enlarged, the tracks perhaps pulled up to make way for outdoor beds. But the desperate, clawing fear was gone. Thaddeus reached out and took Sarah's hand. Her palm was rough, calloused, and stained with the indelible ink of the soil, just like his. He looked back into the station, where the golden light of the setting sun set the rows of vegetables aglow, turning the leaves into translucent panes of stained glass. It was more beautiful than any cathedral he had ever seen. "We aren't ranchers anymore, are we?" he asked, the realization settling on him with a peaceful weight. Sarah squeezed his hand, leaning her head on his shoulder. "No," she said softly, watching the first green shoots of grass poking through the snow on the distant hills. "We're the station masters." The train was never coming back, and it didn't matter. They had built a destination that didn't need to go anywhere. They had planted their flag in the dust and turned it into a garden, and as the stars began to wheel overhead, the Iron Creek depot breathed with them, alive and enduring.